Fall is the time for vaccinations, a study that finds vaccines don't just protect us from infectious diseases, they're also apparently associated with reduced risks for dementia. Dr. Donald Vinh is an infectious diseases specialist at the MUHC. Hi, Don.
Hi, Mitsumi.
So, Don, it's not uncommon to hear older people showing signs of mental decline after a severe case of flu. There is something to that, then.
Yeah. So, in fact, we've known since the 1918 flu pandemic that influenza isn't just a lung infection. It can also affect the brain and the nervous system. Now, there's two types of neurologic complications caused by flu. There's acute and there's chronic. Acutely, flu can sometimes cause delirium, seizures, psychosis, or even brain inflammation in and around the time of the lung infection, although it's rare. But in the long term, flu is associated with an increased risk of neurologic diseases like stroke, dementia, and Parkinson's, especially in older adults or those with heart disease or genetic risks.
The shingles virus, apparently in particular, has shown it can more directly affect the brain. Why is that?
Well, shingles or zoster is that painful rash that's caused by the same virus that causes chickenpox when it wakes up years later. But shingles doesn't just affect the skin; it actually attacks the nerves, causing the debilitating pain. But it can also affect the nerves of the brain. Now, previous studies found an association between shingles vaccination and lower risk of dementia. But a nice, recently large study published in Nature took advantage of a very unique situation to provide even more proof. In Wales, people born after September 2nd, 1933 could get the shingles vaccine, while those born before that date could not. So this created two nearly identical groups separated only days apart in age. And the study found that the people who received the shingles vaccine were about 20% less likely to be diagnosed with dementia, and this protective effect was especially strong in women. So this study provides some of the strongest evidence yet that shingles vaccination not only protects against the painful rash, but it can also decrease your risk of dementia.
Now, you alluded to this earlier, but flu and pneumonia, they are associated with neurodegenerative diseases. Why this connection? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so the idea that infections might play a role in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's actually dates back to 1907, although stronger evidence began emerging in the 1980s. And what we know is that there are two pathways that viruses can cause brain damage. On the one hand, some viruses can actually enter the brain and damage nerve cells directly. So we see this, for example, with the herpes viruses, which are the viruses that can cause cold sores or shingles. On the other hand, some viruses harm the brain indirectly by causing such widespread inflammation in the body, and that inflammation in turn damages brain cells. So, in fact, when the flu is complicated by pneumonia, that intense inflammation not only leads to a serious lung disease, but it's linked to higher risks of developing dementia from brain damage later on in life.
Now, these studies are also finding that the flu vaccines are associated with the ability to risk dementia, to lower the risks for dementia even years later. Why this delay?
So actually, Canada was at the forefront of this observation. Back in the 1990s, Canadian researchers followed thousands of older adults and found that people who had routine vaccines like tetanus and polio were less likely to develop Alzheimer's later on in life. That was the first clue that vaccines might be beneficial beyond just preventing infection. And since then, studies from around the world, Taiwan, US, Europe, have all shown that people who get their flu shots year after year tend to have lower rates of dementia. And the more flu shots they've had, the stronger the protection seems to be. Now, not every study agrees, but the overall evidence suggests that vaccines not only prevent infection, but they also possibly protect the brain. And that could be through either training the immune system to clear the harmful brain proteins that are linked to Alzheimer's, or possibly calming inflammation that occur elsewhere, which then subsequently damages the brain cells.
Now, very quickly, Don, because we're almost out of time, but what are we to make of studies like this? Isn't it possible, too, that people who stay up to date on their vaccinations also tend to take better care of themselves?
Yeah, so you actually have you hit the nail right on the head, right? It's very possible that what we see so far is an epidemiological link, that is to say, vaccination leads to lower risk of some diseases, but that biological connection is not entirely mapped out. So it's not clear. Does it because the infections cause dementia and we're decreasing the infections, or maybe the infections simply reveal signs in earlier in people who are already vulnerable? But the corollary is, as you say, are people who are up to date on their vaccines more health conscious, and just being health conscious in itself leads to fewer neurological complications. But this is what science is trying to figure out, and this is why we need to do ongoing research.
Okay. Thank you very much for this, Don.
Thank you, Mitsumi.